Hello everyone, welcome back to another one of Rose's waxing lyrical about a record in my record collection. So today we're doing one of my favourite albums of all time. Probably one of the loudest and fastest, most important rock records to me, maybe of all time. It's Motörhead's Overkill. Look at the shine. So it was released in 1979 and it kind of fills that gap between like rock and roll and, because it's not quite heavy metal, it's not just rock and roll, and it's got punk energy, so I think it's very reflective of sort of my musical taste and the way that I play, not just because I try and play like Fast Eddie Clarke sometimes, but also because it's kind of that punk rock and roll thing that nobody really sort of talks about, even though it's very clear and obvious. It was recorded at Roundhouse Studios and Sound Development Studios by Jimmy Miller, who previously worked with, the Rolling Stones. He did the likes of Sticky Fingers. So it's not a cruddily produced album by any means. It is very well produced. It sounds great, but it constantly kind of sounds like it's on the edge of falling apart in sort of a glorious way, in a gritty way, which is kind of hard to explain, but if you hear the likes of, Stay Clean or Overkill or No Class, you'll get it. And then what's interesting about that is that Miller didn't try and polish Motörhead's sort of live sound. It's kind of captured in this. I say that about a lot of these albums, but I'm saying it for a reason. So it's loud, aggressive, and it's slightly chaotic. If you haven't heard it, go have a listen to it and then come back, so whenever I make sense, makes sense. Actually, don't exit my video, stay on it, listen after. It was recorded on analog tape, so the harder that they sort of push the equipment, the more that it's kind of, the sound is naturally compressed. Any producers out there, don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty certain that's what's going on. And obviously, Motörhead clearly pushed it because this sounds like the band is right in front of you, so clearly they got that right. And so the band on Overkill is the classic lineup, maybe even the best lineup. I am partial to the Brian Robertson era, which probably get me shot down a little bit, but it's got Fast Eddie Clarke, Filthy Animal, Taylor, and Lemmy on bass. Fast Eddie Clarke plays guitar, Filthy Animal plays drums, you see. And I think, coming from a three-piece band myself, it is great that these are like an example of a three-piece that doesn't sound like a three-piece. They blooming well fill out that sound, which is very important to me because there's only a guitarist, a bass player, and a drummer in my group. And that's obviously because of Lemmy's bass sound, partially because of the fact that he doesn't actually play it like a guitar. He tends to like chord it sometimes. I don't really think that there's ever an instance of him picking out notes individually like a traditional bass player would. And that obviously adds to the sound of that. And then I'm pretty sure that this album was done using all Rick basses and then like Marshall stacks, like guitar amps, which I think is part of what made the sound like that, because obviously those are traditionally used for guitars, and then putting a bass through them, it's gonna be pretty darn overdriven. And then they don't call Fast Eddie Clarke for nothing, because it's like a combination of sort of like traditional rock and roll blues guitar, but with some kind of other. It's actually just amazing. There's no other way of describing it. It's brilliant. I, draw things from it from myself. And actually, according to the back of this, on the track Limb from Limb, which is a great track actually, the second guitar solo is done by Lemmy. Talking more about the individual tracks, there's a very obvious thing that I must talk about here is the name, the title track, Overkill, has double bass drum pedals. And it's obviously one of the most famous moments of the album. And considering this was recorded in late 78, it's quite revolutionary, the fact, and very uncommon, that there is double bass drum, like double kick pedals on an album, which is very groundbreaking and pretty flippin' awesome. Again, don't like to use that word lightly, but flippin' awesome. So it therefore, without changing the timing of it, it makes it sound faster and more like aggressive and more in your face. It sounds like something's running at you, something's gonna come get you, which I think is pretty fitting with the album cover and the fact that it's called Overkill. It's not exactly overkill, I think it's perfectly kill with the album title. I'll stop there, you see. And then I was also gonna say that with the three-piece, the fact that the choice of guitars is important, because a Rick and a Strat, you'd expect maybe like a thinner sound, but then I also remembered that in Fast Eddie Clarke's Strat there was in fact a DiMarzio humbucker pickup type. There was a DiMarzio pickup in the bridge, So it obviously sounds a little heavier than a traditional like single coil thing, which obviously helps with the sound. But it's stuff like the drum pedals that kind of like makes the whole thing sound slightly out of control. Because it doesn't push the tempo, but it makes the tempo sound quicker. And I think that is just, it's really clever. Whether they meant it or not, it's really damn clever. And that's the case with, you know, No Class, I Won't Pay Your Price, I'll Be Your Sister. Fantastic tracks. Fantastic tracks. I'm like fangirling. I always do this. I come on these videos, I'm like, yeah, it's actually one of my favourite albums of all time. I'm fangirling, whatever. It's great. And then I also think it's quite important to note that this album is a good example of the way that Motörhead didn't really like try and fit into the traditional sort of like rock thing that, you know, the rock rules, as well as the fact that punk was out at this time. I mean, this is recorded in late 78, released in 79. And with, you know, you can hear that obvious sort of rock and roll influences. In fact, you can tell with the fact that Lemmy was in Hawkwind before Motörhead, and you can tell all that. But it obviously resonated with the punk audiences because of the energy and just the overall, it's the overall attitude to it. And so the music ends up living in this like strange place between punk, heavy metal and rock and roll. I don't really say that this is a heavy metal album. I agree with Lemmy's reasoning that, you know, it's just rock and roll, because I wouldn't associate it with the sort of heavy metal that Judas Priest and Iron Maiden and stuff are sort of linked in. Feel free to debate me on this in the comments. I'm always up for discourse, but that's just my personal opinion, and I think it is the epitome of punk rock and roll, and I haven't just coined that term by myself, but I think that it obviously, it's sort of a natural progression from the likes of, you know, what the MC5 were doing in the late 60s, but like in, you know, 10 years later in a more modern way. And then it just really inspires me because you can tell it's an album that they've done that it's not, I've chosen it because it's my favourite Motörhead album. I have other Motörhead albums, but this is my favourite one, and I wasn't supposed to create a video on why it was the greatest Motörhead album. It's just sort of my thoughts on it. But you can tell it's one that they haven't created to cater specifically to what critics are going to think, or, you know, to fit into any kind of allocated rules. They were just making the kind of music that they wanted to hear, which is kind of one of my philosophies in life. And so I think it's great because it ignores categories and it focuses on, you know, energy and honesty and what they want to do, and so I dig it. And so I think that Overkill is one of the most exciting rock albums ever recorded. Rock and roll albums, as Lemmy would say. So if you haven't heard it, don't be silly. I think every time I say on these videos that, have you heard it? Blah, blah. Put it on. Put it on, you silly goose, because you won't regret it. I hope you loved it. Thank you.